is at an individual level. So then I was going to a meeting in Washington, D.C. Andy, remember when we had the DibTech Coordination Center and you and AAPD were involved?
Explain what a DibTech is.
Disability and Business Technical Assistance Centers. They are now called ADA centers, right? There's one in each of 10 regions in the country. We've got someone from region 4, isn't that right, Barry?
Right.
Yes. So we had a grant, and Andy worked with us to organize a research agenda for all 10 of the ADA centers. So I'm coming to a meeting with Washington where Andy and many of the others are going to be. I get into the cab, and remember these myths and misconceptions. And I said to the cab driver, I'm traveling by myself, and I said, I'm going to the Washington Hilton. And when we get there, if you could drive me a lot of times cab drivers will drop you off on the street and be like, it's over there. Can you just pull into the lot and drop me off at the front door? And I said, because I'm blind. And so I'd need that assistance. He said, okay, seems like he's a very nice guy, very friendly. And he says, okay, I'll be happy to do that, no problem. So let's talk first about the misconception of spread. So I'm sitting there, I'm going to this meeting with a number of high-level disability advocacy folks. I've got my briefcase. I got a coat that fits me better than this one. I'm dressed up. I'm on a business trip, right? So I get in, and he says, okay. He said, now there's a flat fee, the fare from Reagan National. It's going to be $23. And I said, okay. He said, so that would be if you have a cash, that's a $20 bill, and then you're going to want 3 ones to go along with it. And I said, okay. I got that. I said, what if I want to give you a tip? He said, well, let's say you want to give me $28. That'd require another 5. And I said, okay. So then he's talking, and then he says, so I'm assuming he thinks right, because I'm blind, I think maybe he thinks I can't do simple arithmetic. Or maybe he's trying to be helpful. Maybe he thinks I can't, right? I'm not sure yet. So I go on, I think a little bit more, I'm thinking about this a little bit, but not really. And then he leans back and he says, in a very loud and slow voice, he said, what is it that you are doing here in Washington, right? Have you ever heard any experiences before, right? And he was talking both so I'm thinking about spread, right? He thinks I can't hear him, right? And he also thinks I probably can't comprehend, I'm guessing, or maybe he's not thinking at all. Maybe there's just something else going on.
Or maybe he's disabled.
Maybe so. Maybe he's got a speech impediment and I'm applying my bias onto him, right? Okay. Either way, I answer the question, and I'm kind of just thinking about this, not really beyond it. I still just want to get to the cab. I'm kind of, till I get to the hotel, I'm a little nervous. I'm thinking about this, but I'm having to kind of process this. So let's say there's the myth of spread, right? The misconception, right? So I have the visual impairment, but I'm not limited in these other areas. And I think he must have thought that. So, but he said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going here for a meeting for my work. And he turns around almost completely and he's like, you work? Wow, that's awesome. No, he was really nice, but he was surprised, okay? And I said, yes, I do. He said, what do you do for work? And I said, I work at a university and I teach in this program. Well, that's awesome. And so he was very proud of me, which is good. And my mom is, and so I'm like, that's cool. But how about the myth of unemployability? It surprised him, right? And maybe that's because of the way I was dressed. I don't know, but he thought that was odd. So then I told Amy I would call her when I land. I call her and I said, it's raining here and I'll call you when I get done with my meetings and whatever. So we have this brief conversation while I'm in the cab. And he said, yeah, it is raining here pretty hard today. And I said, yeah, my wife says it's really sunny in Akron, Ohio. Turns around again. You're married? I swear to God, just like that. But and I go, yeah, how long? I don't know, 4 years or something like that at that particular time. And he's like, that is awesome. Well, it happens to be, but he didn't even know, Amy. He doesn't know how awesome it really is, except he seems surprised. So now I'm clicking off the myth of what? Asexuality or whatever. Now, if he'd seen us together, he'd really be like, how did that happen? But that's okay. So that's a legitimate question. So I'm just wondering what's really happening here, but he's very pleased with me. Then he turns back around. He said, say, I was just wondering, is your wife blind too? Right? And so there we go with the myth of the myth of congregation, meaning that people with disabilities only want to be around other, and it wouldn't matter if she was, I'd still like her and love her as much as I do. But it happens not to be true. And how likely would that really be, right? So within one cab ride, right?
Yeah.
I'm confronting all these. 2 days later, I went back to Kent and I'm teaching about, my lecture is on myths and misconceptions. And I'm like, and if you have any doubt that this is real, let me tell you about my cab ride with this super nice fellow. He was so proud of me, so happy. And by the time I got done, I found, he didn't even have to help me with the cash, and he thought that was very impressive. But in 20 minutes, I experienced all of these kind of all at once. And so I was just saying, that kind of reaction. And so I wasn't feeling all that limited when I'm going to meet with Andy Imperato and all the guys at the National AD guys and gals in the ADA centers in Washington, at the Washington Hilton. I'm feeling very pleased. By the time I got done with this, I'm starting to have to reconsider some of this, because he's thinking my achievements around marriage and the fact I'm employed at all are much more noteworthy than anything else, So it seemed just this weird, talk about salience and centrality, that I had to kind of process all at the same time. And it really made me have to think about this in a broader kind of context. And I see people deal with this all the time, of course, and it's not just me, but it's kind of just an unusual example of that reflection. And if you get that all the time, if that's the response you hear, when do you start internalizing that? And when do you start lowering your own expectations and kind of living down to what looks like this sort of odd reaction? You wouldn't react that way if I hadn't have identified my disability. That's what activated all of these things.
Harold, were you going to say something?
Harold, I'm sorry. Harold, I didn't see your hand, Harold.
No, are you
Go
better
ahead.
at counting money now? Or
Pardon me?
have you learned to count money now? Or?
Well, I don't have any money, but I'm about to have some because I got a great job on July 1st. I'm hoping to have a lot more than I did. So that's it.
Was there another comment?
Thank you, Andy.
You're wanting folks to come out so that the emerging disabilities that you're talking about are folks who already feel or experience disabling conditions, and you want them to come out. How do you, given what has just been said, your evangelism, boy, is really going to be tough.
Yeah, but I think that's true, but I think there's a parallel with the LGBT civil rights movement. I mean, I think there was a time where being out as a queer person in a workplace was a courageous act that was hard for a lot of people to do. It still is in some workplaces. I recognize Kentucky is probably different culturally than Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, where I live. But I feel like we are making progress. And part of the reason we're making progress is people with the lived experience are bringing that with them to work, and their coworkers are getting to know them as individuals, and it's changing some of their biases. And if you don't have that opportunity with folks with non-visible disabilities, again, it's not that we can't change biases, but I think we'll change them more slowly. So what I want to be clear, I don't believe in shaming people for being in the closet. That to me, there's no value in that, but encouraging people to be out and reacting positively when people share their own lived experience, to me, is a valuable thing for employers to do, and in any setting, including in academia. But just to go to your question of definitions, to me, there's two competing definitions of disability. There are hundreds of definitions, but there's two big competing definitions. One is a definition in the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the Americans with Disabilities Act and other civil rights laws, which basically says if you can experience discrimination or barriers because of your lived experience or other people's perceptions of your lived experience or your history, then you shouldn't be discriminated against, and we will call that a disability for purposes of a non-discrimination law. It's very broad. And then I would argue the strongest alternative to that is the definition of the Social Security Act, which was written in 1956, which hasn't changed since 1956, which says that a disability is medically determinable. So it's really up to a doctor whether you have a disability. It's medically determinable physical or mental impairment that prevents you from engaging in substantial gainful activity. Most people understand that definition to say my disability medically prevents me from working. That's the plain language version of that definition. And the Social Security definition controls $500 billion of federal spending, federal and state spending around disability. The ADA definition has no budget connected to it. So the Social Security definition is the dominant definition that people with significant disabilities live under in this country and in many countries. And there's a great book called The Disabled State by Deborah Stone, who talks about the history, world history of how we define disability. And one of her concepts in the book that I think is really interesting is a revelatory sign. And the concept is we're going to create a system for disabled people, and we're going to make it so unattractive that the only people who would participate in that system are people who are truly disabled. And I would say that's what we've created with Social Security. It is a horrible system. I don't know anybody who's on SSI or SSDI that enjoys engaging with the Social Security Administration. But that is where we spend most of our money to support people with disabilities in this country who are not in the labor force.
Yes.
And the system does everything in its power to punish people when they try to work and when they have any success in the labor force. They get punished with overpayments, they get punished with redeterminations, they get punished for trying to have a life as an adult and working to their full potential. So there's lots of definitions of disability. You know, I think on the ADA, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities side, I think disability is less about doctors and it's less about medicine and medically determinable things. And it's more about society and culture and how you are in a community and in the world. And I think the more we can get disability away from doctors, the more, and I'm talking about medical doctors, the more I think we can start to make disability be viewed as a natural part of human diversity, not as something that has to have diagnosis from a medical doctor in order to be real. You even see it within mental health. So in mental health, you've got seriously mentally ill, right? That's a term. And seriously mentally ill
kidding, right?
are the really screwed up people. And then you've got people like me that are mentally ill, but we can't be seriously mentally ill because we're running a $6 million organization. And that concept of serious is just not helpful, at least in my view. My bipolar disorder is serious. You know, I could kill myself. That's pretty serious, you know. But I just think it's very dangerous when we try to draw lines and say, okay, that is real, and that is, you know, you're a neurotic lawyer or whatever. And I don't know. I really feel like everything we've done as a culture and as a society to sort out the truly disabled from the people with hangnails or the fakers or whatever you want to call it, it has all kinds of negative consequences.
Do you think that's changing? As we talk a lot about the graying of America, right? As people are getting older and experiencing impairments. Do you think there's shifts that are happening in society now and in the way that we think about disabilities as a result of that?
I mean, you know, you guys are academics, you guys do research. This is all stuff that we could study and measure. My kind of observation, and Senator Harkin talked a lot about this, is that the young folks who've grown up since the passage of the ADA, who he referred to as the ADA generation, these are young folks with and without disabilities. They tend to think about disability differently than folks who grew up before the ADA. And one of the things that we've noticed is there's more disability pride in the younger generation. They see a stronger connection between a disability identity and a sexuality or, you know, other types of identities. They have a political frame for disability. They're interested in studying disability in a political frame in college and in high school, although they rarely get that opportunity in high school. So I think that will lead to different kinds of behaviors in the workplace. I think when ADA generation folks are supervisors and they're supervising people with disabilities, I'm hopeful that they're going to come at that role with a little more openness to, okay, this is part of human diversity. What do I need to learn to be a good supervisor for this person, as opposed to how can I make sure that this person doesn't use their disability to get away with something, which seems to be the attitude of some supervisors.
I think is definitely heading in that direction. And I'm thinking about with the graying of America, you know, we have 73 million living Americans born between 1946 and 1964, the baby boom generation. They have one thing in common. They're not getting any younger, right? And aging out.
Is that a they or a we?
We all do, right? Yeah, yeah, that's right. How about we? That's right. So it's more inclusive, isn't it, Andy? And then dealing with age-related conditions of all kinds. Those folks, many of them didn't see themselves as people with disabilities because, in fact, they weren't until age 62, and you have to have a hip replacement or whatever. And you see, and the incidence of disability increases starting at age 20 as a straight linear function of age. The older you get, the more likely you are to acquire a disability, probably more on the medical and economic side of the definition, Andy, not so much in terms of the minority group model, right? So I think what we're seeing is people who didn't identify themselves with the movement or as people with disabilities at all now are experiencing those and those conditions, and they don't think of themselves in that way. So you say to a 64-year-old person who has just been diagnosed with diabetes, are you an individual with a disability? No, what are you talking about? I just told you I have diabetes. You see what I'm saying? So they think of it in terms of whatever they're dealing with at that particular time. And
but I also think it's worth remembering that there's a reason, right? Why does somebody who gets a diabetes diagnosis not want to immediately connect that to them having a disability?
Sure, yeah.
Part of it is because the person who gives them the diagnosis rarely is steeped in disability culture or disability policy,
right.
or can speak
This is what's wrong
with
with
any
you. Yeah.
fluency to how this is a disability and how it shouldn't stop you from doing any of the things that you want to do. And I feel like they get that from the media. There's a lot of ways that people get an image of disability, and we can change that. You know, we can change the way medical professionals are trained so they have cross-disability competence that they can deliver when they're delivering a diagnosis. But that's not how we train medical professionals.
Right. Because it's almost like that's the outcome, right? The
Right.
disability, that's the end.
I hesitate to say this in a group of people who are working in the field, but our own fields, even if they're not medical, we perpetuate some of this as well, not in the direct service practices, but in the very nature of the way our services are oriented. If you work in the field of special education, you can't work with a child in public schools who needs any kind of assistance without that child being labeled or diagnosed with some kind of disability really coming out of the medical or psychoeducational model. Becky, in the state voc rehab program, you still have to have a documented disability, right? From a medical or psychological expert, and it has to have an impact on your employability in some way, or we can't serve you, right? And it's really hard to so the whole kind of deficit reduction model, what we're doing, we're trying to, we're taking people who have been adjudicated as having something wrong with them and applying some services that will right that or correct that in some way. And in so doing, will address or ameliorate the disadvantages that they experience, which gets to more of the political action kind of definition. But the very services and supports that are in place for people with disabilities are driven and steeped in the medical deficit reduction model. I say that with all due respect.
But I think part of the reason for that is we have a culture of scarcity around resources.
Yes.
So why does VR have order of selection and all these things they do to try to sort out the people that are disabled enough to be at the top of the list, but also able to have a successful employment outcome? It's like you got to kind of thread the needle there. Well, the reason they do that is it's a $4 billion program. We're spending $500 billion on poverty and retirement programs for 18-year-olds with disabilities, and we're spending $4 billion on VR.
Yeah.
So they've created a way to figure out how to spend that money around a culture of scarcity. To me, the way that you expand the resources for VR is by putting the VR philosophy at its best, the mission of VR at its best, in charge of all $500 billion. So if now we have $504 billion to spend to support people with disabilities in this country, can we spend it better and get better outcomes?
Becky, I think we could, don't you? Yeah.
Your successor is going to be succeeding Tom Harkin to push this legislatively.
I mean, I think Senator Casey has really kind of stepped forward as a champion. Part of it is he's on the right committees. So he's the ranking Democrat on aging and has a budget from that. He hired Senator Harkin's disability policy director, former president of AUCD, Michael Gamble McCormick, who ran the USED in Delaware. So Michael's his disability policy director. He's also on the HELP committee, which is what Senator Harkin chaired. And he's on the finance committee, which is really where the money is. And the finance committee is Medicaid, Medicare, SSI, and SSDI. So I think there's going to be a caucus. I don't think it's going to be one person, but Casey definitely is positioning himself. Tammy Duckworth is positioning herself as somebody with lived experience who cares deeply about these issues. Maggie Hassan, who's also on the HELP committee from New Hampshire, has a child with an intellectual disability, and ran for governor, really got involved in politics because of her experience as a parent. And she was groomed and mentored by our USED in New Hampshire. So there are a number of members, most of them in the Senate or on the HELP committee. On the Republican side, Kathy McMorris Rogers has tried to be a strong champion, not just for people with Down syndrome like her son Cole, but for the broader disability community. She spoke at this event that I was at the Department of Transportation this week. I'm hoping that Senator Burr from North Carolina is going to start to embrace some of these issues. He's moving into the chairman or ranking, depending on whether the Senate flips or not. He's likely to be the chair of the HELP committee after the election. And he was the lead Republican on the ABLE Act, which was kind of a modest effort to make it possible for parents to set aside money for their adult children with disabilities without it hurting their eligibility for benefits. What I like about the ABLE Act is the vision, right? What does ABLE stand for? Achieving a better life experience. And I think it was mostly led by Republicans, although it was bipartisan. Casey was actually the lead Democrat in the Senate. But the concept is our children as adults deserve a better life than what we've created in SSI and Medicaid. And they're right. So let's talk about how we can really make that work, including for families that don't have money to set aside to help, pay for things that SSI or Medicaid won't pay for. So, to do this work for 26 years, you kind of have to be an optimist. I am optimistic about the future. I recognize right now Washington is broken, but disability is an issue that brings the parties together. The Secretary of Labor did an event on mental health in the workplace on Wednesday. That was his first public event as a Secretary of Labor. And he's Antonin Scalia's son. His name's Gene Scalia. So I don't know. We always find allies in strange places. We also find enemies in strange places. But I am hopeful that Harkin, Kennedy, kind of the important generation of folks who did ADA and other big laws, the people coming after them take that mantle seriously and want to build on it. And what we haven't had in my 26 years is real leadership on the Finance Committee and on Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce in the House, which is where you would have to have the leadership to change the Social Security programs and Medicaid and Medicare.
And as those things happen, disabilities that were submerged will begin even more to emerge.
I think that's right. And I think the question is, so if we just assume the $500 billion pot is not going to get bigger, let's assume that for now. I actually think it could get bigger, but assuming that we're limited to that pot, I do think we have to pay attention to equity. I want to be clear, when I say everybody who wants to be disabled should be able to be disabled, I'm not saying they all should get the same resources. People who have more intense support needs should get more support. But we should have a way of figuring that out without forcing them to prove with a letter from a doctor that they can't work, which is how our system works right now.
That's where a functional model versus a diagnostic model becomes crucial.
Agreed.
And I think looking at it from the Kentucky perspective right now, there is a great appetite for inclusion of disability in workforce. And the governor has taken a very strong interest in this. There's it's called the Kentucky Works Collaborative, and largely cabinet secretaries are part of that. The governor chairs that council. The Chamber of Commerce is part of that. We have a seat at the table there, and they're really trying to look at how to make sure that disability metrics are included. How is Kentucky recognizing the segment of the talent pipeline that's being missed? And just like definitions of disability vary very widely, so too does the data that we look at in Kentucky. But we know clearly that there is vast disparities for those who are in the labor force and those who aren't with disabilities. And the VR system is being recognized as, hey, they do a good job. And if we're talking about return on investment, people are getting to work, and that's what we need to see as a model of helping people achieve employment and seeing all the other things that are necessary to be able to go to work, and all of the social issues and transportation and healthcare and childcare that all have to fall into place for it to work. And it works well in the VR system. And so too, that is where we think about universal design and how can we best broadly capture a workforce to meet needs of both employers and maybe also thinking about looking beyond what a job description is as well. But what are the needs of an employer? What are the skills of the people that are coming from that talent pipeline? And maybe throwing the job description away.
My question is so Section 14C, part of that, I would work with Department of Labor as an investigator. And so I did a couple of investigations in Section 14C program. And when I went to training to discuss it, there was a section about how great the program was and how it's beneficial, but at the same time, it was maybe perceived as not being taken advantage of individuals with disabilities because of the supplemental wage.
Yeah, so just in case people don't know, Section 14C of the Fair Labor, you want me to repeat the question?
Please.
The question brought up Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act and just how the debate that's going on around that law, which has been around for a long time, relates to some of the stuff that we've been talking about. Is that a fair restatement?
Yes.
So Section 14C is a provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act that says if somebody has a disability that affects their productivity in a job, you can pay them less than minimum wage because their productivity is less than what you would expect in that job. And under Section 14C, there are employers that pay people 10 cents an hour. And some of those employers have CEOs that are making $400,000 a year. So there's a national debate going on in the country about reforming Section 14C. It's been a while since that law was updated. The nature of work has changed since that law was written. We used to have a lot of factories where people had to produce a certain number of widgets. Thank you, Walt. Most jobs aren't like that anymore. And even in jobs that are like that, the big question I would have is, are they getting all of the accommodations and technology supports that might help them be productive? I feel like you create a weird conflict of interest where if by keeping all the supports that they need to be productive, you can pay them less. And then you say, well, they're not productive. That's why I'm paying them less. So Senator Casey has a bill called the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act, Competitive Integrated Employment Act, that is a phase out of 14C with resources going in to help entities that it's a certificate that you get to be able to pay somebody less. So help the certificate holders and the service providers that work with those communities to transition to competitive integrated employment. What the argument that gets made in support of 14C is that it's often made by parents. And the argument is, my adult child with a disability has a job and it works for my child. And if you're going to take that away, I want you to guarantee me that you're going to have something to replace it with. And we don't have a good answer for those parents. Their kid does not have an entitlement to move from a 14C job to a competitive job. We can provide supports and try to help that, but that's not going to work for every family. And if we can't guarantee every family that their kid's not going to sit at home and watch television instead of going to what they see as a job, we're going to have a lot of angry families. So I think there's a way to do it where you grandfather people that are currently in those settings, but you make sure everybody has an opportunity to do competitive integrated employment. Senator Harkin put a provision in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which authorizes the vocational rehabilitation system. The last time it was reauthorized in 2014, it said that a young person cannot be tracked from high school into a sheltered workshop unless they've applied for services from VR and made a reasonable effort at competitive integrated employment. He thought of that as a kick in the pants in the direction of competitive integrated employment. And he was most bothered by the idea that young people would be tracked into a segregated setting, never having had an opportunity to experience what something else feels like and looks like. That's a modest step in the direction away from segregated employment. The whole idea of segregation also gets complicated. There is such a thing as self-segregation. Sometimes people like working with other people who are like them, and like figuring out whether somebody would choose that or whether they're kind of being influenced to choose that is hard to know. But independent living centers, majority of their workers are people with disabilities. If all of their workers were people with disabilities, would we have a problem with that as segregation? And is it really about 100%? What if it's 90%? What if it's 80%? What if it's 64%? Like, what is the magic number where it's not segregation anymore? So I just feel like all these questions, there's like a politically correct answer, and then there's the messy reality of how we do it on the ground. And it's all happening in the context where we're underinvesting in direct support professionals. We're underinvesting in job coaches. We're underinvesting in all the things that we need to be in place for people to have more success in the competitive labor force.
And that's what I saw when I was out there in the building investigations. It seemed really simple into the training, and you get there, and it doesn't make sense to you. You have individuals who want to, who are really capable of doing their job, and they're performing at 100%, but they don't want to leave. They can do it for 30 years, and this is what they want, and they're adamant. You ask, do you want to go work at Toyota and do this? It was no. This is where I want to be. And other individuals who they don't want to be here at all. Younger individuals who are wanting that integrated employment, but there aren't enough supports in that rural area for them, and so they can't make that transition, and so they're frustrated and acting out. And yeah, it's just not as clear cut as it's.
Was there a comment over here?
I just sort of had a question. You've talked a lot about the definition of disability, both internally and externally. Can you link it back to like the theme of emerging disabilities? I'm not sure I quite follow the connection.
Yeah, I'll do a quick answer, and then I think Phil has obviously thought a lot about this. Any conversation about disability needs to start with a clarity about what are we talking about. So if we're talking about emerging disabilities, it invites a conversation about, well, first of all, what do we mean by disability? So I think what we're talking about is relevant to, okay, if disability is a very broad category, then what are some of the populations that are starting to participate in systems that require a connection to that category, like special education, that maybe weren't participating in those systems or weren't participating in great numbers in the past. But I do think kind of being clear about what we mean by disability is part of that conversation. But, yeah.
No doubt. And would it help if I were to just suggest some populations within the disability community that are emerging either on the sort of more clinical definition that I shared, or the one Andy talked about in terms of attention and place on the policy agenda? Would that
that'd
be helpful? So here's a few I'm thinking of. What we know about the disability community is that it's getting both younger and older, if that's possible. So we have more children being born with disabilities than ever before. And part of this is a simple fact that many children are surviving complicated and high-risk births and pregnancies that they didn't used to, and yet then they're surviving over longer periods of time with greater support needs. So we have larger numbers of children with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities who are being born, and they're living longer. So we have more a greater need overall for early childhood interventions of various kind. In special education, we're already starting to see, that moving in that direction as well. People with and without disabilities are living longer, than ever before. So people with disabilities, life expectancies are increasing dramatically. So I'm thinking in the Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland, Ohio is, in the County Board of Developmental Disabilities, they have an entire unit of developmental disabilities case managers who work only with people who are over the age of 55. Well, 30 years ago, there really weren't any people with intellectual or developmental disabilities over the age of 55. So, and so they're outliving their parents and you're probably experiencing that here and all, everywhere. And so the support needs change. There's larger numbers of people because they're living longer. Age-related disabilities, look at diabetes, orthopedic impairment, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. The longer you live, things wear out, low vision, people who are hard of hearing, high proportion of those folks are over the age of 65. So as we have more people aging and the people who are aging are living longer, we've got people with age-related conditions. Parkinson's, for example, all kinds of central nervous system issues. So we see that more. Talked about developmental disabilities. How about autism? In 1968, the year that I was born, 1 out of 3,800 children born that year would be diagnosed with autism. Now it's 1 out of 68 in 2017 and 1 out of 40 males. And Andy will tell you that diagnostic criteria have changed. We're not sure whether there's more people with autism than there used to be or whether we're calling them that, right? In terms of labeling, Asperger's, right? People with Asperger's and other forms of diagnoses on the autism spectrum, they were undiagnosed, many times, particularly if they didn't have an accompanying intellectual disability. We thought they were just kind of, nerdy, or, right? So you see that. How about traumatic brain injury and the incidence of brain injuries among children, mostly due to sports and recreational activities, having nearly doubled since 2000. How about 300?
Also veterans. I mean,
yes,
I don't have the numbers, but I understand the politics. The Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are much more likely to have a brain injury than generations of veterans before them, in part because of the weapons systems that were used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and basically the inability to defend against those weapon systems in terms of creating brain injuries. So
it's huge.
Yeah.
390,000 new brain injuries for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans since 2001. 18% of all people deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan come back with discernible brain injuries. Many of them now are happening because not of explosions that are happening, but from firing their own weapons during training. And the weapons are so explosive and so powerful that they're having many minor concussions throughout the day as part of their training. And the VA even isn't equipped to deal with the needs of those folks coming back. Stress and trauma.
Plus, you get a conflict of interest. When they're active duty, the military does not want to diagnose a brain injury because it becomes a service-connected disability with a payment stream, and neither does the VA. So the people whose job it is to assess these veterans have a conflict of interest, and there's a lot of veterans who clearly have brain injuries that don't get diagnosed, or they try to say, well, you had it before you served. How can you prove that it was because of your service? So there's a lot of mishigas in the disability benefits on the VA.
No doubt. There's some modest movement, which I think is really encouraging, toward the military being willing to keep people who have been injured in the service on active duty with accommodations and deploying.
Although they're still very resistant to somebody coming in with a disability.
Oh, forget that.
Senator Harkin tried to help
right.
He tried to help a deaf cadet who had gone through ROTC training to be in a test with the Air Force. And the Air Force monitors space. I mean, there's a lot of jobs that the military does that are not, but they have this rule that you have to be worldwide deployable. And if you're deaf, you can't be worldwide deployable. But if you become deaf because a bomb goes off, you can stay in the military. So it's
More
a,
and more. They used to literally process you out and then argue whether it was connected. And so that's moving in the right direction, I think, albeit slowly. The chronic pain epidemic, we have 100 million Americans dealing with chronic pain, and that then gets to addiction to prescription medications, out to opioid analgesics, the heroin epidemic, meth. So substance use disorders look different than they ever did before.
and
Yes,
the other
sir.
thing I'd bring up that I don't know if we have great data on is just the impact of this. I mean, I'm holding, for anybody that can't see it, I'm holding up a cell phone. I have a 6-year-old niece, and when we go out to dinner with her, she is looking at a cell phone the entire time, watching YouTube videos of people putting on makeup. When we went out to dinner with my children, they couldn't sit still, and my wife and I took turns going for walks with them. And I really worry that this is the de facto babysitter for a huge percentage of a generation of young people, and we don't know what that's doing to their brains, and much less the brains of their parents, who are also addicted to the technology. So
And
I
from an
think,
attitude
I mean, I don't know if
perspective,
there's
yeah, no,
good data on this,
oh.
but I really do feel like this tech-enabled universe that we're living in is creating disabilities. It's creating attention problems just because of the culture around the technology.
Well, it's creating a disability, if you think of it that way. It's also having an impact, I think, on attitudes. I think these are, sometimes these devices can be really depersonalizing, and the disability experience is personal. So if it makes you disconnect, and how about the YouTube videos of watching, people bullying kids with disabilities and putting it on, it's sort of, it becomes so desensitized to literally anything. Nothing ever really seems real. And so I think that's a huge issue. On the other hand, that same device also helps people with and without disabilities connect in ways that they might not have otherwise. Telecommuting and employment from home with technology. So it cuts both ways.
Texting was revolutionary for the deaf community in terms of opening
Wasn't
up
it? Sure.
lines of communication. I'm not saying there aren't good things associated with this addictive device.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that we don't necessarily know all the disabilities that it's creating right now.
No doubt.
Is
No doubt.
dementia, like Alzheimer's, is that considered a disability?
Yes.
Oh, yes. And 7 million Americans had some form of dementia in 2012. 2030, we expect 14 million. And that's purely an age-related phenomenon. If you live long enough, you'll have dementia, right? And so we see that all the time. In terms of mental health, just the impact of our stressful society on it. So you see a huge increase in stress-related disorders, PTSD, diagnoses relating to traumas that we didn't even understand what they were. 30 is totally different kind of profile there. There's a whole new in the mental health category of addiction. There's electronic addictions, right, that are now viewed as mental health disorders. So these are some of the things that we're seeing. People with these kinds of, and the workout that our environment gives our immune system, for example. So this really odd proliferation of autoimmune disorders that we're seeing. Multiple sclerosis has doubled in prevalence in America since 2004, for example. And conditions that are related to, say, climate change and extreme weather events, and not only the physical aspects of that, but what about experiencing these natural disasters that we're seeing happen, a 500-year storm every 6 months, right? And what is the impact? And what's the impact of watching that on television, even in terms of how people are processing
Or
that?
worrying about it.
And worrying about it.